The sky above the earth has always belonged to those bold enough to conquer it, but there was a moment in history when one nation didn't just reach the sky, it quietly mastered it, operating at the very edge of space where no enemy could follow, no missile could reach, and no radar could fully understand what it was seeing. At a time when the world lived under the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation, when fear traveled faster than truth and suspicion defined global politics, the United States built something so advanced, so daring, that for years it seemed almost untouchable. This was not just another aircraft, not just another military project, but a machine that redefined what power looked like in the modern world, a silent observer that could cross entire continents without being stopped, a ghost in the sky that carried with it the confidence of a nation determined never to be caught unprepared again. And high above the frozen landscapes of the Soviet Union, beyond the reach of fighters and defenses, there was a pilot alone in the darkness, trusting that the technology beneath him represented the very peak of human ingenuity, believing that nothing on Earth could bring him down. This is the story of that aircraft, the one that changed espionage forever, the one that flew where others could not, the one that turned the sky itself into a strategic advantage, the Lockheed U-2. Long before satellites filled the orbit above our planet, before digital surveillance and instant intelligence became the norm, nations relied on what they could see, and more importantly, what they could not. After the end of World War II, the sense of relief that swept across the United States was quickly replaced by a colder, more calculated realization that a new kind of conflict had already begun. One without formal declarations, without clear battlefields, but filled with tension that could erupt into catastrophe at any moment. The Soviet Union, once an ally, had become an enigma, a closed world hiding its capabilities behind layers of secrecy, and for American leadership, ignorance was no longer acceptable. The memory of Pearl Harbor still lingered, a painful reminder of what happens when a nation is caught unaware, and this time there would be no surprises. The problem, however, was immense. How do you observe a nation that refuses to be seen, a superpower that guards its borders with increasing aggression, where even the skies themselves had become hostile? The answer required something unprecedented, something that had never been attempted before, an aircraft capable of flying higher than anything in existence, beyond the reach of Soviet interceptors like the MiG fighters that struggled to even approach such altitudes, and far above the range of early missile systems that simply could not climb high enough to pose a threat. Engineers understood that if they could reach above 60,000 feet, they would already be operating in a realm that was nearly inaccessible, but that was not enough. The target was pushed even further towards 70,000 feet, an altitude so extreme that it doubled what commercial aircraft would typically reach, a zone where the air is so thin that conventional flight becomes almost impossible and the human body itself begins to fail. At the time, no aircraft could do this, no design had ever been pushed so far, but that did not stop the effort. Instead, it intensified it. Inside one of the most secretive environments ever created, a specialized team of engineers began working on what would become one of the most iconic reconnaissance aircraft in history, a machine designed not for combat, not for speed, in the traditional sense, but for altitude, endurance, and invisibility. Built with minimal weight and maximum efficiency, the aircraft sacrificed comfort, safety margins, and even ease of control in favor of achieving something extraordinary. Flying it would not be easy, and surviving inside it would require pilots to operate at the very limits of human endurance, wearing pressurized suits similar to those used by astronauts, breathing carefully controlled oxygen supplies while navigating a machine that left almost no room for error. At such heights, the difference between safe flight and total loss of control could be measured in just a few miles per hour, a razor-thin margin that demanded absolute precision, where a slight mistake could mean stalling into a fall or pushing the structure beyond its limits. And yet, despite all of this, the aircraft worked, not just in theory, but in reality. When it first entered Soviet airspace in the mid-1950s, it did so with a level of confidence that bordered on disbelief, flying directly over one of the most heavily guarded regions on Earth, capturing images of military installations, nuclear facilities, and strategic assets that had previously been hidden from the world. Below, Soviet radar operators detected something unusual, something high A, and both sides were constantly evolving, constantly learning, constantly searching for ways to overcome the other. The Soviet Union began developing new radar systems, more advanced tracking capabilities, and most importantly, a new generation of surface-to-air missiles designed specifically to reach higher, to strike targets that were once considered untouchable. At first, these developments were uncertain, theoretical, but as intelligence reports began to surface, it became clear that the balance was shifting, that the skies were becoming dangerous once again. And yet missions continued because the need for information outweighed the risks, because understanding the enemy was still the most valuable advantage of all. Then came the mission that would change everything. On May 1st, 1960, a U-2 aircraft piloted by Francis Gary Powers took off on what would become one of the most infamous reconnaissance flights in history, a deep penetration into Soviet territory designed to capture critical intelligence on missile development programs and strategic infrastructure. The plan was ambitious, crossing vast distances and photographing multiple high-value targets before landing safely far from its point of origin, a demonstration not just of technological capability but of strategic reach. As the aircraft climbed to its operational altitude, it once again entered that familiar zone where it had previously been safe, where it had always been beyond reach, where pilots had come to trust that their altitude alone was enough to protect them. But this time was different. Soviet radar systems tracked the aircraft from the moment it approached their borders, following its path with increasing accuracy, coordinating defenses in a way that had not been possible before. Fighter jets attempted to intercept, but as always they fell short, unable to climb high enough to engage, and for a moment it seemed as though history would repeat itself, as though the aircraft would once again pass through untouched. Then the missiles launched. A new kind of weapon, designed specifically for this scenario, climbed rapidly into the upper atmosphere, closing the gap that had once guaranteed safety, and at an altitude of over 70,000 feet, one of those missiles detonated near the aircraft, sending shrapnel tearing through its structure, disrupting its stability, and forcing it into an uncontrollable descent. In that moment, the illusion was broken. The aircraft that had once seemed invincible was now falling, and the pilot, thrown into chaos, struggled to escape as the forces acting on him made even basic movement nearly impossible. When he finally separated from the aircraft and descended toward the ground, he carried with him not just his own fate, but the weight of a mission that had gone terribly wrong. The United States initially believed that both the aircraft and its pilot had been lost, and in an attempt to control the narrative, a cover story was quickly prepared, claiming that a weather research aircraft had strayed off course. But the Soviet Union had something far more powerful than speculation. They had evidence. They had the wreckage, the equipment, the photographs, and most importantly, they had the pilot alive. When this was revealed to the world, it was more than just an embarrassment. It was a moment that exposed the reality of a hidden war, a confirmation that espionage operations had been taking place at a scale and depth that few had fully understood. The political consequences were immediate, tensions escalated, diplomatic efforts collapsed, and the fragile balance between two superpowers became even more unstable. Yet, despite all of this, the story of the U-2 did not end there, because even after being challenged, even after being brought down, it continued to evolve, to adapt, and to remain relevant in a world that was rapidly changing. Decades later, long after satellites had begun orbiting the Earth and new technologies had transformed intelligence gathering, the U-2 remained in service, a testament to the brilliance of its original design and the boldness of those who created it. It had flown in conflicts across the globe, gathered intelligence in situations where other systems could not respond quickly enough, and proven that even in an age of advanced technology, there was still a place for a high-flying, human-piloted aircraft capable of seeing what? The truth is, no nation in modern history has ever transformed fear into power quite like the United States did in the years following World War II. Out of the ashes of uncertainty, Out of the shock that still echoed from attack on Pearl Harbor emerged a relentless determination. Never again would America be blind. Never again would it be caught off guard. And so, in the silent tension of the Cold War, where the world stood on the edge of nuclear annihilation, the United States didn't just build weapons, it built vision, it built reach, it built something that could see beyond borders, beyond fear, beyond the very limits of the sky itself. That creation was the U-2, a machine so ahead of its time that even today, decades later, it still flies where others cannot, watching, observing, protecting. This wasn't just engineering, this was dominance written across the heavens. As the years after the war unfolded, the uneasy alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union dissolved into suspicion so thick it could almost be felt in the air. Intelligence became more valuable than firepower, because knowing your enemy's next move meant everything in a world where a single miscalculation could trigger global destruction. Yet there was a problem. America simply couldn't see deep enough. Satellites were still in their infancy, unreliable and limited, and traditional aircraft risked being shot down the moment they crossed hostile airspace. The Soviet Union guarded its secrets with intensity, sealing its borders and hiding its military expansion behind a curtain of silence. But the United States refused to accept blindness as a limitation. Instead, it asked a question that would redefine aerial warfare forever. What if a plane could fly higher than anything ever built before, so high that it would become untouchable? That question led to one of the boldest engineering gambles in history, driven by the brilliant minds at Lockheed Corporation, particularly within its secretive Skunk Works division. Under immense pressure and surrounded by secrecy, engineers pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. They stripped weight, reimagined aerodynamics, and created an aircraft that looked less like a conventional plane and more like a glider built for the edge of space. The result was the U-2, an aircraft capable of flying above 70,000 feet, a realm where the sky darkens and the curvature of the Earth begins to reveal itself. At that altitude, it wasn't just flying, it was operating in a domain that no enemy aircraft could reach at the time. It was, quite literally, untouchable. But this technological triumph came with a price. Flying the U-2 was not just difficult, it was borderline insane. Pilots operated on a razor-thin margin between aerodynamic limits, where a difference of mere miles per hour could mean the difference between maintaining flight or spiraling uncontrollably toward Earth. The aircraft demanded absolute precision, absolute focus, and absolute courage. These were not ordinary pilots. These were individuals willing to place themselves alone, thousands of kilometers behind enemy lines, with no guarantee of survival if something went wrong. Wrapped in primitive pressure suits, breathing controlled oxygen, enduring extreme physical strain, they became something closer to astronauts than traditional aviators long before space travel became reality. And yet, despite the risks, the missions continued. The United States needed answers, and the U-2 delivered them with extraordinary clarity. From its unimaginable altitude, it captured images of Soviet missile installations, nuclear facilities, and military movements that had previously been hidden from the world. Entire regions could be photographed in a single flight, revealing the truth behind the Soviet Union's capabilities and intentions. This intelligence reshaped American strategy, providing leaders with the information they needed to make decisions that could determine the fate of millions. In a war where knowledge was power, the U-2 became one of the most powerful tools ever created, but no advantage lasts forever. As the Cold War intensified, the Soviet Union adapted, developing new technologies designed specifically to counter the threat posed by high-altitude reconnaissance. Radar systems improved, and more importantly, surface-to-air missiles evolved into deadly weapons capable of reaching the heights that once guaranteed safety. It was only a matter of time before the balance shifted, before the sky itself became contested once again. And that moment arrived on May 1st, 1960, during one of the most infamous missions in aviation history. On that day, a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers embarked on a daring flight deep into Soviet territory, tasked with capturing critical intelligence on missile development sites. It was meant to be another successful mission in a long line of successes, another demonstration of American technological superiority. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, leave your like, and share with friends for more content.